Building technology-focused communities, bringing together organizations of all sizes and experts from varying backgrounds, moving industry standards forward and advancing cutting-edge technologies through open, time-tested processes to identify technically and commercially sound solutions to shared industry challenges. Since 1989, the vendor-neutral, not-for-profit Object Management Group has facilitated these objectives on a global scale. You'll find our standards implemented across land, sea, and beyond, on your smartphones, in your transaction receipts, even on the International Space Station. Today, our standards innovation continues through the OMG Standards Development Organization, developing enterprise-grade standards and technical specifications, certifications, and more. In parallel, we're driving digital transformation across ecosystems with our growing portfolio of targeted consortia. And all of this, it's driven by you, the experts. Where is technology going? You decide. And together, we'll tackle new industry challenges. OMG, building technology communities. By you, for you, about you.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the first of hopefully many in our webinar series covering the salient points of Essence and what it brings to the table. This webinar is brought to you by Object Management Group. And to kick it off, Ivar will give an overview of the standard of Essence and what it means, and then hand it over to some of our other guest speakers. Thank you and enjoy.
So what I'm going to talk about is what is Essence and why should you care? I assume that there are some of you that don't know so much about Essence, so I will. For some of you, it may be a repetition, but let's get started. So, the uncomfortable truth of software engineering. That's where I would start. We have a number of real serious issues. We look like a fashion industry. We change fashion, throw out the old fashion. That has happened all the time since the beginning of software engineering. In the 1960s, 1970s, we had a very popular approach with function and data separated. We got object-oriented, we got component-based development. We got rational unified process, my baby, and UML, of course, and CMMI, and then we got XP, Scrum, Agile, Scaled Agile, and the next big thing, what's that? Well, it looks like Agile start to be a little overused, so now it's artificial intelligence. But we look like a fashion industry, and the problem is we throw out the old stuff as soon as come new thing. It's very expensive to the industry and so on. We have methods war. We have many different methods. There are over 1,000 methods that are documented one way or the other publicly since the beginning. Now we are talking about 20, may be some methods that are more popular than others, and they are not really good friends. They are, it's like religious wars around every popular method. There is like a sect that supports it and defends it. We have gurus. I was once a guru around rational unified process. It was fun, but stupid. I don't think we should have any gurus. We should have experts. Yeah, we can have people who know more, but gurus are methodology salespeople. And we have no common ground between methods. So every method is like an isolated island. If you have learned one and want to learn another, you have to go. You have to start over as if you were a freshman. And finally, we have a split between industry and academia. Uh, things they are not working on something together very rarely, and very little of the academic research where we spend so much money is ever useful in the industry, and very much more. I call these some of the craziest things with methods and frameworks. I wrote a paper about that. I never use terms like crazy in my normal professional life, but this is nothing less than crazy. So take the comic Achilles, a very popular um, member of LinkedIn that make cartoons. Here you see the method camps and how they have built walls between one another and so on. This is a lot of fun to read this stuff. We know common ground. Everyone has their own homegrown way of describing their method. And unfortunately, if something becomes popular, they cannot change it. It's very hard to change it in the long run and they use techniques to describe their method that is starting to be antique. And that's not true for everybody, but it's true for maybe the most popular. They share a lot, but it's hidden. It seems just that the alphabet is the only thing they share. So now let's me describe essence in just a few words. First, a disclaimer. It's not another method. It makes any method or framework significantly better as far as we have seen so far. Concretely, it's like a specification to reuse when you describe a method or framework. I mean, when you start to describe, you don't need to start from scratch. You don't need to start to describe the most elementary things in software engineering. This is what essence is, but this essence is much more than that, as you will see. It is a standard common ground. And we have got one. We have never had one in the history of software engineering until 2014, when Object Management Group took the standard essence. That took 5 years to go through a very thorough process. Essence is basically two things. It's a language, a very simple language, intuitive, and it is a kernel that is what is specific for software engineering. Things that it's not controversial, there is nothing controversial. We took away everything that could be controversial. Hundreds of people in OMG has reviewed and helped make this a standard. So to be a standard, it needs to be non-controversial. The language is very simple too. It's basically 4 or 5 icons. Practice is described in terms of a couple of other things. Activity, and you have seen that symbol for a long time, not only now. And work product, that is like documents. That's the thing you produce when you perform activities. But there is one new thing that you may not have seen if you don't know about Essence. That's the concept of we call alpha. The most important things you need to progress when you do anything. Alphas have states. So for instance, requirements is just an example of an alpha. It's untouchable, intangible. You cannot, because it's not a document or anything like that. Requirements, for instance, is something you may have even if it's not documented. But what's important about it that it moves from state to state over a lifetime. So from the beginning, you may not have much of a requirement. You may just have conceive them. But at some point in time, you have a good understanding of requirements. And competences. You need competence to perform activities. That's basically it. And of course, it doesn't take long to learn the language. It takes a little longer to learn the kernel, but it's not a big project. Here's an example. This is Scum, not Scum, it's daily stand-ups from Scum. It has one card that shows all the different elements in this practice. There are 5 different elements, and one of them is the activity to hold the stand-up. As you see, there is a little text, but describe what to do. And then there is an arrow, a fat arrow that go down, and in that are 2 star symbols. They are competences. So you need competences of leadership and management, and there is also a number inside that which says what level of competence you need to have. And on top of this, there is what you need to do and what you have as input, and at bottom is what you have as output. Then we have what it works on. It works on the alpha impediment. There is an impediment that we need to work with. So impediment, alphas have states. In this case 3 states, and you move from state to state by performing activities. And here is an example of one state. You have cards for every state of an alpha. So this is the state owned of impediment. And there is a checkpoint that you need to check to have reached that state. And on top we have patterns. That is one of the important things you need when you perform activities. In this case, you have 2 different alternative patterns to use to do daily stand-ups. All this is available also at your fingertips on your phone. So let's say a few words about what it means to essentialize. We have, for instance, Scum Guide to the left. It's 7,000 words, and essentializing that, this is the source for essentializing. You get 21 elements, and they are represented by, each element is represented by a card. In the left hand, the structure and language is selected by the authors. There is no standard. It can be a well-written document or a badly written document. At the right, it's Essence. It uses the Essence language, which is the standard. And it helps you use these cards to learn how to guide the progress. Here is Scum, 21 cards, if I'm not wrong. There are patterns and roles. Patterns are represented as principles and roles. And there are things to do. There are things to work with, the alphas, 3 alphas. And then you have work products to the right, different things you produce that are tangible. In this case, it's Scum is 1 deck of cards, which you can use for a quick reference. You can improve your Scum implementation. You play games, you perform health checks, and integrate Scum with other practice. This is an important thing. You can, since if other practices are also described using Essence, you can use them and integrate them. So here I show 5 different other practices that are essentialized: user story, use cases, Kanban, test-driven development, and DevOps. And you get you integrate this to a method. So and that can be done thanks to the way the Essence language is designed. There is a paper on this written by Jeff Sutherland, and it shows and describe experience of using essence for describing scum. One important property which is I need to lift up is that essence is actionable. For instance, you see essence as a multidimensional thinking framework. It has 7 dimensions in essence, and there are stakeholders to think about, opportunity, why do we do this, requirements, software system, and then there are a way of working, a method or whatever you want to call it. There is a team or many teams, there is work to be done. All these things move while you do perform an iteration. So this is the start where you see stakeholder is in state 2, opportunity in state 2, require, and these are all defined what it means. Now later, you have reached, after later iteration, you reached other states. And as you see, you have progressed. That is thanks to these essence cards. Every dimension, for instance, opportunity here, has states, and for each state there is a checklist. In this case, it's opportunity in viable state. To get to the viable state, you need to be able to basically say that we have reached this state. Of course, you can skip it. It's up to you. But the good thing here with this is that these cards works as placeholders for conversation. The state conversation is guided by a poker-sized card, and there are many such placeholders for activities, competences, and so on. So this is part of a standard. The interesting thing is this is not mathematical, but the value is that people have something to talk around in a team, and we agree in the team on what state we are in and how much progress we have done and what we are going to do in the next iteration. So essence have many things that makes it valuable. We call it, to use a dramatic language, we call it essence have killer use cases. And there are killer uses for many things. I'll talk about some for the industry and for the teams. So one of the beauties is that there is an ecosystem of practices. A team can select, a team within a team of teams can select their own method. Not every team needs or should have the same set of practices. Usually there is different levels of competence. They may be distributed or sit together. They may have different kinds of problems to solve. So it's logical and helpful that they can select a set of practices that work for them. Another thing that is a really big problem is in our method space is adoption of method. And one thing is to learn, and another is to deliver. So basically, there are 2 cycles, learning cycle and deliver cycle. Most methods and frameworks and organizations that promote these focus only on the learning. And by having training and so on. But and the move to delivery has to be done either by people themselves scratching their head and think of what am I now supposed in this particular situation, or you get the consultants. But unfortunately, they're not easy to get consultants. So I call this the Achilles heel of method adoption. With essence and practice is described with essence, you move from you get support to move over to delivery. You create tasks and lists of activities, items to work on, but you can move into, for instance, Jira. Another thing is that all existing methods and frameworks, they have a passive user experience. With that, I mean they are you have training and you can have websites, you can have books, and so on. But to really learn, you need to get a much more active user experience, and that is happening through game playing. So Essence is gamifying software engineering. Now, there are other killer use cases for organizations, academics, and for methodologies. Around the world, in the academic world, there are many universities around the world that today are teaching Essence. Professor Pekka Abrahamsson in Jyväskylä in Finland says, my software engineering education in the future will be driven by Essence. But he is not the only one. There is a forum, Essence Education Forum, with more than 60 university professors to work to promote Essence. And that work is very active. We, in the industry, which is of course where we target it, but personally, I think it's very important that we get the academic world to be interested in doing research and educating this. So we have one client is Hapag-Lloyd, and here's a beautiful statement from them. There are many of these working and adopting Essence, and we'll soon hear about others. In the method space, Jeff Sutherland was the first actually to adopt essentialization. And his opinion is that essence is the key to driving success. He's not the only one. Today, we have partnership with several methodologists, Joachim Sundin with the Spotify model, David Anderson Kanban, Scott Ambler Disciplined Agile. He's now on his own, so he's doing other things with Essence. Dave Snowden, Kinefin, and Hexis. Nigel, that you will hear from soon. Ken Pugh, acceptance test-driven design and behavior-driven design. And Jeff Patton, story maps. And there are many more in the pipeline. So we are see very positively on the adoption. There is also a meetup with more than 4,000 members, and but you can get the recordings on this link here. So if you're interested, that is basically what I want to say. So welcome to the future. I think it's here today. So now I will introduce the other speakers. First we will hear Simon Girvan. Simon is responsible for Essence, a product owner for Essence in my company, and he started with us 2 years ago, almost 1.5 years ago, and has done a fantastic job working with many of these, basically all these people that I mentioned have been working through him. So he's fantastic. We will after him hear Carlos, who is a professor. His name is Carlos Mario Zapata Jaramillo. He is a professor at the National University in Medellin in Colombia. And the wonderful thing about him is that he has made not many wonderful things. He made a fantastic statement in an article. He said he believed that basically, it's not exactly what he said, but basically he said, I believe that in 400 years, people will talk about essence in the same way as people today talk about Newton and Galileo's work. But the Carlos and I met the first time back in Colombia. I was invited to a conference there. Carlos is also chair of a CIMA chapter in Colombia, and he's many things. A very good friend. Burkhard is the second, the third speaker. Burkhard is at Munich Re, and he has this senior IT strategist and owner of Munich Re's IT technology is methodology. But Burkhard and I have also known one another for more than 10 years. When Burkhard started to, and his team and his organization, Munich Re, started to work with what was on the path to be Essence. Finally, Nigel, who is CEO of the Flow Consortium and has co-authored the book The Flow System with John Turner. And Nigel and I met the first time in Lisbon last year. It started by a common interest in good wines and fantastic restaurants. Yeah. But then we actually started to talk to one another and found out that there is absolutely a lot of common interest in methodology and so on. So I'm delighted to hear what these gentlemen have to say, starting with Simon.
So Ivar has talked a little bit about the theory and the killer use cases and what Essence is about. So what I'd like to do is show you what Essence looks like in practice a little bit more. So from the perspective of a development team, so you'll hear that there's lots of different perspectives on Essence, and this is just one. But before I do that, I'd like to ask you a question. I'd like you to think about a team. Maybe it's a team that you're in, maybe it's a team that you've worked with, or just a team that you know. And on a scale of 1 to 10, where 10 is highly confident, how confident would you say you are that that team is performing perfectly? That their way of working perfectly matches their task and their team composition, the dynamics, and that it's allowing them to deliver maximum value for their customers, and it's definitely not getting in the way. On a scale of 1 to 10, where do you think you might be? Now, I'll not ask you to fill the chat with it, but just bear it in mind. And while you're thinking about that, think about this as well. We've been doing agile and iterative approaches for decades now, and they all advocate continuous improvement. It's baked into SAFe, it's baked into Scrum. And then we've got retrospectives. Many teams conduct retrospectives, they find improvements, and they tailor and tweak their practices. So if these two things are true, why is it not the case that every team has already optimized its way of working? It's already got the perfect match of practices that are completely enabling them to deliver value. And why is it not the case that more of you were thinking of the number 10 when I asked that question a minute ago? Because I'd be surprised if very many of you picked 10. And there's a number of reasons why that might be true, but there's two that I think are quite important in this context, especially. Teams are using practices that are not a good fit for them and for their endeavor. Now, sometimes that's because they've been forced to use them, and sometimes it's because they've always worked like that, or they don't think any better. And if they've got the right practices, it's very often the case that teams don't apply them very well. They're misunderstood, applied wrongly, inconsistently, or incompletely. Jeff Sutherland says that the average Scrum team only does 1/3 of Scrum well. They do a third badly and a third not at all. So there's lots of people using what could be the right practice, but not using it well. And if you put these two things together, if either of them are true, it's a great recipe for poor performance, poor quality, poor value, and poor motivation of your teams. So then what can we do about it? Well, not unsurprisingly, this is where Essence can come and help, because Essence allows us to create awesome teams that have the right practices, and not only the right practices, but practices that they're using well. So I want to show you why that's true and show you with some examples what that means. And I'm going to use a little model which has got these three parts. Explore, so from a set of practices, find the ones that are right for you and your team. Then explain, so understand those practices so you know them well. But we lose a lot, we forget a lot from learning something to trying to apply it. So we've got to put effort into exploiting that practice that we've got. We've got to put effort into making sure we continue to apply it well and we continue to understand it, which tackles that problem Jeff would talk about. And one size doesn't fit all. We know that as Ivar said, the practices will be different from team to team, but even in the same team, and this is part of the stuff that Nigel will perhaps talk about, as a problem changes and evolves, so too does the team's response to that problem need to iterate and evolve. So this is an iterative process. So let's think about that in practice. And let's think about a team. It's a team called Castle, and we'll join them at various points over their journey and see what they're doing with Essence and with TeamSpace, which is this product that I'm screen sharing here, and how they use Essence to help them become, if not a 10 team straight away, certainly on that journey. So we begin with an ecosystem, so a set of practices. So here's an example of an ecosystem of practices. Now, there's some that you will find familiar. Scrum. And this is, as Ivar said, a practice that we developed with Scrum Inc. and with Jeff Sutherland. So you know when you've got a practice like this, it's one that you can trust because the people that understand the practice best have helped describe it. And when we talk about an essentialized practice, it's the essentials. So it's about reminding you of the core parts of a practice. We've got Kanban here. We've got at the top acceptance test-driven development. And we've got other practices like this one. So you won't have heard of this one because this is unique to this organization. So they've found a gap that benefits from having a practice, and they've used the Essence language to create a practice. And their ecosystem is a combination of bespoke practices and famous or generic or general use practices. And we could just give that to the team. We could say, off you go, and that would be nice empowerment, but it's also perhaps a bit risky. So what this organization's done instead is they've got an ecosystem that has a little bit more structure to it. And we can see what that looks like here. So we have some practices that actually every team is going to use. So it's not a choice, but ideally that's as few as possible because we do want to dial up some empowerment. So there's practices here that are practices that they can choose between. And in an ecosystem, you want to understand a little bit about the practice. So you can click on a practice and you can read about it. You can see what the elements of it are, like Ivar was showing in the slides before. And in this case, we've got a little bit more depth. So here's an overview of Scrum that's created by the community of practice. And that's a much richer picture. We can see the cards that Ivar explained. So for our improvement to be identified, we expect to see these two things happen. We can see the different elements of Scrum. We can see some guidance on them, so the duration of a sprint, and we've got an idea of how things relate. So we can draw a picture that helps us understand Scrum in a little bit more detail. And then we might have even less structure and less guidance, but it's good to do something on our stakeholders. It's good to do something on the system. And in this case, there's three things that this organization wants to particularly focus on the progress of, and that's two of the alphas, team and stakeholders, because they're important, and also what they're doing with their epics. So what about our team? What did they pick? So let's have a look. This is their team room, and you can see it's got fewer icons at the bottom, so they haven't got as many practices as they could have brought in. They've just brought in the ones they think they need, and they've still got these essential ones. And of the recommended ones, they've picked Scrum and user stories. Now, one of the benefits of TeamSpace is that you can integrate the practices into the tooling that you use. So this team room knows what practices the team's using, and we'll see how that impacts in just a second. And the other thing we've got is this concept of things we call game boards. So they're canvases, and this is an example of one. And this team has a few others. Some of them are overviews, like the ones that we saw before. Some are game boards that have been used to support a workshop or an activity or an event. Some are health checks, we'll come to them in a second, and some delve into a practice in a bit more detail, like this one. And this is a really nice way of how Essence, and you can do this with the cards or with the tooling, but how Essence allows you to really focus on a part of a practice and understand it well. So in this case, the product owner was new to the role. They weren't trained, but they needed to understand what it meant to be a product owner. So they created this picture that takes the important parts of being a product owner, and it draws a picture for her. Now, what's really nice about this is that it's not just a picture, and this is that unique integration of the practices with the tool, because if I click on product owner, I can see from this trusted Scrum practice what it means to be a product owner. I can see what it means to have a backlog and all the other bits. So I don't need to remember what it means. I don't need to go and find the definition. It's at my fingertips. Now, one of the features this brings is it causes the team to rely less on coaches and consultants. The Scrum Master is no longer the only person who needs to know the rules of Scrum, because everybody can know the rules of Scrum because they're there in the tool that they're using. It lets the Scrum Master focus on high-level coaching, and the team's much more self-sufficient. So you can kind of think of Essence and the tooling here as being a bit like an online coach. It knows about your team. As we'll see in a second, it knows about your progress, and it knows about the practices you're using, so it can help you get the best from your way of working. And one really powerful way that it does that, and Ivar hinted towards this earlier, is through the use of health checks. Now, there's several different types. Some are really simple, good, bad, okay. And then there's those that are built into Essence, and that's the health check, the kernel health check. Now, in this case, the team had already been working when they got introduced to Essence. One of the first things they did was decide, well, let's use this Essence health check to see how we're doing. And they chose to use all 7 of the alphas. They didn't have to. They could have used fewer, but you can see there's 7 rows here. And if we zoom in, we've got those questions on the card, and this is an interactive board, so I can see if I tick it, that box fills up, and then if I look at this opportunity elsewhere, it's going to have remembered that that's my state. So I've got the state following me around my team room as well, and we can zoom out and we can see trends and things like that. But I want to focus a bit on the stakeholders, because this is an interesting one. I noticed this when this was happening. So bearing in mind this team was already in traction, they were doing quite well, and they had identified their stakeholders. They were allowed, they were authorized to work with the team, and they were actively assisting the team. But when the team got to the questions that were about whether the responsibilities were defined and agreed, they weren't so sure. They weren't sure that that was true, and they weren't sure that if they asked everybody around them, they'd all agree. And that was a bit of a surprise. They hadn't realized this was a problem until these checklists prompted them to think about it. And that's why Ivar talks about Essence as being a thinking framework. It doesn't give you a prescribed list of things you must do and say, if you do these things, you will succeed. Instead, it says, here's a set of outcomes you should achieve. How you achieve them is up to you, but you ought to achieve them. Now, at the point they did the health check, it was probably okay that these weren't checked. But as the project progresses, the risk that this causes problems is also going to increase. So there becomes a high chance that the teams take direction from one stakeholder when they should have been taking direction from a different stakeholder or additional stakeholders, and then you've got problems. And this is why these checklists, in essence, are really good leading indicators. So the fact this isn't checked here, it doesn't tell me I've got a problem today. I don't need to fight fires, but it does tell me I'm highly likely to start having problems later. And the earlier I know about that, the easier it is to address and the less likely it is to have those problems. So what the team then did was they said, well, what do we do about it? And then we come back to our practice ecosystem. It turns out that under stakeholder management practices, there's a thing called a RACI, workshop to create a responsibility assignment matrix. And what they decided to do was to run that activity from that practice. And they've created a to-do to remind them about it. And they've decided this is what we want to do. And it's all built into the tool. So again, you can track some of these things that you notice when you do these health checks, and they can mark it as closed if they want. So, the thing with the checklist as well is that these things can change. So the thing the team also decided was we need to come back to this, because especially when we think about some of these, and this is a nice example, we've got at least one investing stakeholder interested. That's great if your organization is very static. Once you've ticked that once, it probably stays true. If your budgets are static, your approvals are static, your people are static. If you've got more dynamic organization, it might be that this project loses that investing stakeholder at some point before it delivers. If that is true, it's really important to know that. So you want to come back to this frequently, maybe every month or 2 or 6 weeks, and just double check these things are true, because otherwise you're going to have problems, and that's again back to that leading indicator. So we've seen briefly how this Essence and using Essence helps teams find practices from the ecosystem, helps them explain, like with that product owner, how to use a practice and understand it, and it helps you to keep track of what you're doing with, say, the health checks. And there's lots of other examples I could talk about. I want to show you one more. And we talked about this team being part of a wider organization, so let's look at how we can deal with teams of teams. So if we come back to this progress monitoring, we said that the organization cares about how we're doing with our stakeholders, how we're doing with our teams, how we're doing with our epics. And we've got a means of tracking that in one place, where we've got the same idea with states. So these are instances now of epics. So we've got an epic, which has got several states, and I can have multiple instances of that potentially have different states. So we can see at a glance the pattern that we've got. And if we look up here, for example, you can start seeing a few trends. So it looks a bit like, there's some patchy things in stakeholders. And when you've got gaps, where you've got things ticked in later states and gaps earlier, that suggests you might have some risk. So maybe this organization wants to look a bit harder at their stakeholder management. But you've got the ability to have these kind of overviews as well. So in conclusion, we've had a very quick look at some of the features of TeamSpace and showing how Essence works with actual teams in real life, although this is a composite. I didn't want to betray any NDAs. And I could have shown you a lot more, but we've looked at it through the lens of this one team. And we've seen that Essence helps you with this cycle of exploring, exploiting, explaining, the exploration through ecosystems that might have some structure and can include custom practices alongside trusted practices, with helpful posters and overviews that help you understand the practice to see whether it works for you. And there's other ways of finding practices that are right. Once you've picked your practices, because again, one size doesn't fit all for learning a practice. So there's multiple ways to learn a practice, different ways to reinforce that learning and to help it sink in, including cards and posters and serious games. And then when you're applying a practice, how do you make sure it's being applied well? And partly it's about having that reminder of what the rules, the essentials of a practice are for you. Now, it's probably not all plain sailing. Creating an ecosystem requires a bit of skill, and teams need the culture where continuous improvement is not only expected, but probably necessary, and where they're empowered to make the changes that they need to. And as we saw, the health check can expose some quite serious problems that might not be terribly easy to resolve. But knowing about them is the first step, and it allows you to get towards that state where a team is, if I can find the right part of my place, where you are creating awesome teams that have the right practices that are working for them and not working against them, and you can get far closer to being a team that you would be describing in that question at the beginning as a 10, and that's what Essence can help you do.
It's you, Carlos. Next.
Okay. Thank you so much, Simon, and thank you for the introduction, Ivar. Okay, I will tell you a little story about what Ivar was mentioned about the war method and the way the war method affected the Colombian industry of software. At the beginning of this millennium, we were working with Rational Unified Process, the Ivar's baby, and of course, You remember this kind of pictures trying to show the phases, the iterations, and all the information we have about the rational unified process. The Colombian software industry was working with this kind of methods, and of course, in Colombia, there is a gap between the origin of the technologies and the implementation. I think in 2012, an Argentinian company, consultant company, came here to Colombia and show us something completely different. And I remember when they say, "Hey guys, forget about all the things you know about rational unified process, because we have something completely different." Something completely different was Scrum. In that year, the Colombian software industry knew Scrum, and they start to say that we had a completely different idea about software engineering. Actually, they say we need to forget all the things we know about software engineering, because they advocate that rational unified process and Scrum were very different in the way they perform the things. But at that moment, we didn't have we didn't have essence, and we didn't have something like a common ground to know if these guys were promising something completely different to what we have. But what I remember about rational unified process is one practice. The first practice about rational unified process say that we need to develop software iteratively. So we have iterations, and we have all this stuff in mind. And after that, they say something that they say something about the Scrum, saying that we need to work in sprints, something completely different, they say. But I was thinking for myself that it was almost the same. It's pretty the same. And actually, we have an RUP practice called develop iteratively, and we have a Scrum principle called iterative development. Something a little bit tricky, because I was thinking about the way in which we are developing software systems, actually, in the best possible way. What you are seeing right now is the beginning of the essence usage of practices and methods. As you can see, we can use a common ground for comparing both the RUP practice and the Scrum principle, saying that we are working in something apparently similar, pretty similar to what we are doing. So if we go deep in the way to represent the practice and the principle, the RUP practice and the Scrum principle, we will discover some similarities. And of course, we need a common ground for expressing this information. And what we do in my research group is representing things on top of the essence kernel in order to discover the similarities between the methods. So in the first case, we have the RUP practice detail. And you will discover that we changed a lot the name of the practice, because we have a special way to name practices here. We use a nominalized verb, in this case, development, uh, for expressing what the practice is intended to do. We use an adjective, in this case, iterative, as a way to resemble the way of working, the way in which the nominalized verb has been executed, and an object, software system in this case. And this is the intention of the practice. So the RUP practice developed iteratively, we can rename it as iterative development of the software system. So after that, we have, of course, the alpha software system. We have an activity space, shape the system, and we have an activity, develop the software system, and this activity requires development competencies about the way in which we need to develop the software system. And we have uh, a work product named working software. We have another work product called iteration, and we have a role, the developer, who is working on both work products. So this is the way to represent the RUP practice. And after that, if we decide to do the same with the Scrum practice, we will discover some similarities. Actually, we have the same name, because in the principle they say iterative development, but at the bottom of this information is the same name, iterative development of the software system. We have the same alpha, the same activity space, the same competency, and we have some differences in the vocabulary. Of course, we are trying to do the same thing, working software, and we have, instead of iterations, we have the sprints, and they call the developers development team. So if I go back, you will discover that the only difference between RUP and Scrum in this detailed practice is the vocabulary, because we are working essentially with the same thing. We now call the iterations, we call it the sprints, and we have the team, we name the team as development team. So it's practically the same thing. But you don't have the possibility to check out these things unless you have a common ground for comparing what we are doing in some domain. Also, I went to the web and tried to find some other examples about something relative to iterative development, and I found a Squadron System. This is a company dedicated to manufacture drones in the industry. And I discovered that they have something pretty similar to what we are doing. Why? Because they have, in this case, four different iterations for developing a drone. And they start with an initial concept. They improve some things, and they have some iterations to have a concluded drone to sell to the industry. Actually, they refer at this. They refer to this method as something iterative. Iterative. So in this way, we can also represent the practice on top of the essence kernel, and we will have some differences, but I think the template is pretty the same. So in this case, we have iterative development of the hardware product. In this case, is something different. We have an alpha product. We have a space, an activity space called shape the product with the competency of development, and the activity is manufacture the hardware product. We have a working sub-product. We have iterations as the work products. We have a builder. In this case, they call it a builder as the role in charge of doing this thing. So if we represent the practice in another domain, in this case marketing, I discovered that we can create a marketing campaign in the same way, iterative development of the marketing campaign with almost the same structure. So the changes are minor in relation to what we are doing. Uh, the common ground is this: we have software systems, we have products, we have services, and all of this can be generalized as a result. And the the activity spaces can be generalized in one activity space named shape the result. So we have a common practice by the end: iterative development of the result. We have the alpha result, the activity space shape the result, the competency development, and all the information related to this. So this is the common ground. We are actually working on these elements in my research group. We have a lot of PhD thesis and master thesis about what we have right now. We are developing a lot of games about the way to use this information in the best possible way. And of course, if you want to know something more about that, you can contact us, because we are working very hard in sharing the essence standard in the best possible way. And also we are sharing this information with all of the world. In the all of this work is published in our thesis, in our papers, in conference papers, and so on. And we can share whatever you want with you. Actually, as you can see, we are using the same standard. I belong to the Essence Education Forum, and sometimes we have meetings in the 5 continents with many people talking about the same things. As you can see, the way in which we represent things is pretty similar to what Ivar and Simon show you in the previous talks. And of course, whatever you want to know about this, I can share with you. This is my email, and if you have questions, you can put it on the chat. Thank you very much, Ivar.
Thank you, Carlos. So, Burkhard, you are most welcome. And if there is something you want to add to my presentation, please do that.
Oh, indeed, I would like to. The point is, I think it is in one of the aspects you are not completely right. And let me talk about this. Let me just share. So you've seen the list of, as Ivar calls it, killer use cases. And I personally, as Ivar talked about, following Ascent since quite early days, 2010 or something. It was still in an early stage. And then I was a little bit involved in the CMAT initiative to get it standardized by OMG. And I know this list of selecting their own methods and gamifying and supporting teams and learning and all this good stuff. And I buy into all of this. But I would argue these are not the real killer use cases. So I would like to show a real killer use case, at least in our context. And in our context means Munich Re. So if you never heard of Munich Re is a so-called reinsurance. And basically the business model of a reinsurance is bloody simple. It's reinsure insurances. If you go into the details, this business model is surprisingly complex. It's so complex that we need globally around 5,000 people in IT, internally and externally, really to keep this going. And this is an important number I will refer later to. But I started at Munich Re 2006. 2006, from the regulatory perspective, or from my perspective on regulations, it was like paradise because there was no regulations. So we insure other insurances, which means it's a purely B2B. And at this point in time, the overall opinion was, well, both sides are professionals. They know how to do business. No need for regulations. This changed completely and totally. And as Nigel called it, I think in the preparation meeting, if I'm allowed to quote him, meanwhile, regulators are kind of obsessed with the regulations. So what happened is 2018, our regulator, which is BaFin, so the German regulator, issued regulations for doing IT in insurances. The acronym is a German one, VAIT, but it translates to supervisory requirements for IT in insurance undertakings. By the way, the interesting part of this, it's IT in insurance undertakings. It's not just for an IT department. So whenever writes someone macros for Excel in the business department and shares it with another colleague, it becomes, in the definition of our regulator, an application. It must adhere to all the rules and regulations they have issued. During an audit a few years ago, for example, they installed crawlers on our servers and really looked for each and every Excel sheet that's on our servers and started to ask questions. So when was it built? Who built it? How does the release process looks like for each and every Excel sheet? So it's really a big thing. And to give you an impression how big this is, this was beginning of this year. I will briefly translate this, but one of our, it's not a direct competitor, but a big insurance, you may know it, Allianz, in Germany was subject to an audit. And to put it mildly, Allianz was not very amused, and the regulator was also not very amused with the finding. What was in the press is, and that's on the top right, when IT problems get expensive, the IT of the group Allianz is poor, so says the German regulator. And now the Allianz insurance is facing a demand by 2 billion euros. And just to explain it, 2 billion euros means in our terms risk capital. So capital you have to put aside, and the first issue is you have to have this 2 billion euros. It's not something I have in my pocket. Maybe you do, I don't, and probably Allianz doesn't either. And what's even worse is it's not just putting capital aside, it's really maintaining the capital. And typically you need about 8% per year of risk capital to maintain it. So 2 billion euros means around 160 million euros per year just to maintain it. Translate this, do the math, translate it to IT FTEs. How many IT FTEs you can have in your company for 160 million, or how many great projects you can run, or what you can do, or maybe you have to lay off IT people just because of this risk capital, 160 million FTEs. So we are talking really serious business here when we talk about compliance. Or what you probably don't want to see, and this is the other article saying the CEO of Allianz Bete was right. The IT of Allianz is crap. So he published an internal memo that was leaked to the press last year about the IT of Allianz, saying it's crap because we have so many old systems and blah, blah, blah. And now the press is just quoting him saying, seems to be true. IT of Allianz is crap. Imagine, Munich Re is one of the biggest sellers, maybe even the biggest one, of cyber insurance products. As a business person, try to sell a cyber insurance product if the press is saying the IT of this company is crap. So we are talking real money here, we're talking real consequences, and all the insurances in Germany, Europe, and so on are taking compliance currently very seriously and are investing a hell of money really to make the whole IT compliant. So this is our starting point. So we tried to implement compliance. Let me a little bit explain what this is about. So we have our regulators, and it's not only BaFin in Germany, this is US, and name it, everywhere. They issue control frameworks or the regulation. There's one group, one department in our company who translates this into a list of roughly 330, as they call it, controls, security controls and data protection controls. And then they break it down in what they call control requirements, about 1,000 that really are addressing IT, all aspects of IT. Things like we need to have IT strategy, we need to have security officers, we need to have a written process, how to evolve the IT strategy, name it. Each and every aspect is in these controls. Then Munich Re engaged a consultancy and gave them the task, look, we have so many controls, come up with an idea how to describe processes, a way of working or something to give guidance to all our employees, not only IT, also in business departments, that gives people guidance how to do things, how to behave, what do we have to have, and so on. And my personal opinion is they came up with a kind of smallest common denominator. The smallest common denominator is text in words. So what they came up with is this hierarchy, this 3 levels of Word documents, policies, guidelines, and work instructions. And currently about 50 of them address IT aspects. And I guess since you are more or less all IT people, you can easily imagine what this means and what the challenges are. So a bunch of 50 Word documents, thousands of pages targeting roughly 5,000 members of IT. It's really hard to have a common taxonomy across all these Word documents. It's really impossible to make this consistent. In one document, it's called business product owner, something else. It's not really consistent what the accountabilities of the different roles are, and so on and so on. And behind this is not really a precise common picture, a big picture, what all these different elements are and how they work together. And of course, this leads to processes that are overlapping. This leads to work products that are overlapping. One work product is asking for an architecture description. The next work product is asking for an architecture diagram and an architecture picture, and in different templates and in different formats, double work, triple work. But what's really hurting currently is we do not have a precise relationship between the control requirements, and the described way of working in these Word documents. Of course, every Word document says, well, I'm addressing control 15 and 216 and 408. But then you have 50 pages in this Word document, and you do not really know which part precisely in this Word document addresses which control. That's really hard. And one of two other things is, in my experience, this approach leads to a tendency to create just one process to address each and every aspect. And we all know IT work is totally different depending on different dimensions. Technology platform, size, do you have a team that's just co-located or not, and all these different dimensions. But if you work in this way and you have these Word documents, and it's already hard to create these Word documents and keep it in sync with the control requirements, is a strong tendency to just define one way of working, and everyone has to adhere to this one single way of working. Problem. Second problem, I call this the Swiss cheese effect. People just focus on what is absolutely necessary. If there's a topic, for example, how do we record requirements? If there's a topic that's not directly really addressed or mandated by controls and control requirements, no one talks about it, and no one wants to document it, and no one wants to harvest any best practices or something. It's just focusing on the must-have effects, and how all the other things fit into the picture, everyone has to find out individually. I'm a little bit exaggerating here, but that's more or less the situation we had and we still have, and we are working on this. And how does Essence help? Now, consider this statement at the top. A control requirement can be seen as a quality attribute of a thing we care about. This is the starting point, and I would like to explain a little bit how Essence works and how Essence works, especially in this context. And I think the easiest way to explain it is take an example. One of the control requirements is any implementation of a requirement must be approved by the product owner before it goes live. Okay, let's deconstruct the statement a little bit. So the thing we care about here is requirements. So requirements can go from scoped to implemented, tested, ready for go live, and then live. So a state for requirements could be ready for go live. Ready for go live, and this is one of the checklist items you have seen in Simon's presentations. Could be it's approved by the product owner. And these three things are more or less the translation, the breakdown of the control requirement. Auditor's view is, that's great, but I want to see evidence for it. And the evidence could be, for example, that if we have a user acceptance phase, then we create a test report. This lists all the requirements that are in this new release, or the test cases for these requirements, or the test results. And finally, it's signed off by the product owner. So this is a clever approach. Yes, I know we can talk about continuous delivery, and we will in a second, but this could be one approach that at least makes the auditor happy. And what we see here is more or less Essence in action. The thing we care about, Essence calls this an alpha. The ready for go live, Essence calls this an alpha state. Approved by the product owner is a checklist item. This user acceptance test report is a work product. And the beauty of Essence is it clearly separates between outcome and output, which doesn't work as well in German language, but very well in English language. So it's this outcome side, the left side, that's always the same. That's what always is necessary and we have to fulfill and bring to the table. The right side, the output can vary. If we work in a very waterfallish approach, for whatever reason, we might create this user acceptance test report. If we work in a continuous delivery mode, the work product can be different. Maybe it's a step in a pipeline and the product owner has just to tick a box or something and it looks different, a different work product. But the point is we have work products that address the alpha states, or more precisely give evidence that we did our job right. And that's the beauty of Essence here. It really feels totally natural to have control requirements in the model. So it's not anymore 50 or even more Word documents. We have one model that really describes our way of working across the board. We have a clear taxonomy, we have consistency, we can really give evidence, formal evidence, that our way of working addresses all the control requirements we are supposed to address. It's not flipping through thousands of pages of Word documents anymore. And we can provide different options for the way of working, different practices, different work products. The only thing we have to make sure is the work products address the alpha states and the control requirements. Or sometimes we even have big projects that really say we are so totally different and unusual. We do not want to live, or we cannot live with our standard practices. We want to create our own way of working. Fine, go with it. Document it as practice, make sure that we have the evidence between the work products and the alpha states and the control requirements, and everyone is happy. We are happy, people are happy, auditors are happy. So I was always wondering why no one brings this, and this is for us really a killer use case, to the table, because once again, this is really a very, very serious topic, compliance for us. And this really brings a huge step forward for Munich Re. And plus all the other good stuff of Essence. And one thing I would like to add is maybe even for the future, well, I think Munich Re is not the only one who is dealing with compliance requirements and obsessive compliance requirements. So basically, I think it fits very naturally to Essence. It's a kind of, I would say, even home turf for Essence. There could be a kind of standard approach how we deal with compliance requirements, controlled requirements in a sense. And for sure, if we are done with this, I look at Ivar, we might even publish some good stuff so no one else has to reinvent the wheel. Or maybe think about, there might be some researcher who are very interested in Essence. They could take the standard controls frameworks that are out there like NIST or VIT in our case and just translate these control requirements in alpha states, and hopefully there's a kind of mechanism that we can implement, incorporate these standard alpha states in our way of working. So there are plenty of options to deal with compliance, and really Essence for us is really a kind of a game changer in this context, because it fits really so naturally, having Essence to deal with the compliance requirements. I'm now looking at Ivar. Happy?
I think it's wonderful to hear. It's music to my ears, and clearly this is a killer use case. We will, yeah. So thank you very much, Burkhard. I really appreciate it. And now, last but not least, Nigel.
Ivar, how are you, sir?
I'm fantastic.
So I was enjoying all the different conversations and the different use cases. I don't think I've got a killer use case. I've got what might one day become a killer use case. But I'm going to take a different approach. You ready for me to share my screen?
Oh, of course. Yes, of course.
Okay, let me press some buttons. I'm on a Mac, and Macs hate Teams, but that's fine. Okay, so for those that don't know me, as Ivar said, we met for the first time a year ago in Lisbon and enjoyed fine wine and fine food and talked about Essence. So I'm still discovering and learning Essence as a language, Essence as a standard. But I sort of am a bit more known in the Scrum and the Agile world, and my background in Toyota for some 20 years or so. And my bio stuff's on the screen at the moment. So my focus has been in the last few years in looking at something we call the flow system. And some of you may or may not have read the book or seen the stuff online that's free and available. And there is a new book coming out shortly. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the flow system. Burkhard, your mic is still live, just so you know, because we can hear you. That's better. Now, so what is the flow system? I'm not going to go into a great deal of detail presenting the flow system. This is how it's visualized. I'm afraid it's visualized like that because I had a lot of work and years in Toyota, and Toyota like to build houses. So if you've seen the Toyota production system and the Toyota way, that's where the original diagram came from, because this was a collaborative work that I did with Professor John Turner and myself when I was at Toyota Connected, as well as Brian Rivera, who represented the US Navy and some of the high performance teaming aspects that we put together. So let me talk about what the flow system is. It's not a framework, despite having this picture behind me and the picture I just showed you. It's actually a system of learning and understanding for dealing with complexity thinking, complex problems. So that's how we designed it originally. It's a coming together of several methods to better address ambiguity, complexity, and uncertainty. So that's the basic outline of this. And I think there's some more words on here. And this is the important thing. And I was putting some stuff in the chat about, well, how I see essence. But this is a coming together of methods that vary by context and is counter to the concept of universality. So these one-size-fits-all frameworks, like Scaled Agile and others, that seem to just throw everything onto a giant sheet of paper and say, we cover everything, and then give you a prescribed methodology for using it, and it's the prescription that is the problem. So I see Essence as bringing a standardized approach to breaking down tools, methods, techniques, and approaches into various component parts, what we call the lowest level of coherent granularity. And then it allows us visually, in either with the cards or in the workbench that Simon showed us, to recombine tools, techniques, methods, and approaches, the component parts of them, into new assemblies that might work in different contexts. And that's the basis of the work I did in the flow system. So the flow system still focuses on the customer first. We talk about the flow of value predominantly. Flow is a construct. It has different meanings to different people, whether you're lean thinkers, agile thinkers, systems thinkers, complexity thinkers, or in my case, thinking about customers and the flow of value. So we start with the foundational first principle of lean defined by Toyota and TPS way back in 1946 of customer first. We flow that all the way through the way we think within the flow system to achieve a flow of value. And so we believe through the combination of complexity thinking, distributed leadership, and team science, by combining the various tools, techniques, methods, and approaches within these disciplines, it's the way that they interconnect and intertwine that actually give rise to something I'll talk about shortly, which is assemblages. These are the three areas, and we call them helixes or helices, depending on your way of thinking about the English word helix or helices. But we believe we combine these. We don't see them as pillars. We don't see them as silos. They're containers that are split within categories of complexity thinking, distributed leadership, and team science. But we don't see them as isolated. And one of the biggest things that we've found over the years is that people are very siloed in the way of thinking. And we wanted to think more broadly and see how we bring these things together and look at unique combinations of them to achieve better outcomes within organizations. So that's the basic concept. Now, we talk about something called organizational system fitness, which is defined as the ability to sustain existence while also adapting to environmental threats. We see where businesses and organizations need to be far more agile, and I'm not talking about software development agile stuff here, I'm talking about business agility. So if we look at one of my favorite heroes from when I was a boy, when I was a child, Muhammad Ali, we can see that resilience is the speed of recovery and the ability to adapt to change. That's what we call agile. That's the agility. How fast can you pivot and change depending on impacts the system takes? where a robust system is the ability to withstand impact until it breaks. And as my friend Dave Snowden often uses, the analogy of a seawall or the sea defences. They're very robust, very strong, very powerful, but when they fail, the failure is catastrophic. Where a resilient system is constantly adapting to change and constantly finding ways to avoid catastrophic failure, and if they are impacted by external events and triggers, they can adapt very rapidly to those circumstances, and that's being agile. So you might see where I'm going with some of this. Fitness, however, is contextual. A hospital has a very different context to an automotive plant, has a very different context to a university, and so on and so forth. So fitness is contextual, but it's also continuously adapting and is not a fixed value. And that's the idea when we talk about the triple helix of flow in the flow system. It's the combination of those and the interactions of those different component parts within those different helixes within the flow system. So we then started to study assemblages theory. This is Deleuzian theory. It comes out of French philosophers, but we started to look at what assemblages really meant. And there's a paper here you can read that we put out a few months ago. We actually got the domain name. Nobody had taken it. So you can go to assemblagestheory.com and you can read the paper and start to understand a little bit about our advanced thinking behind the flow system. And that's actually what we're covering in more depth within the new playbook, which is due out any minute now. We're in final reviews and indexing, so it'll be out very shortly. So when we start to look at what we mean by emergence, we're talking about the reaction and interaction. So tools and methods are not fixed. They react and interact differently together based on context and usage. They exist in the same moment in that context, but their relationships and interactions will change and dissolve, not to be repeated again exactly the same. And that's what's defined in Deleuzian theory around assemblages, were known as assemblages theory. So by combining things in unique and novel ways, we may give rise to an emergence that wasn't predicted, wasn't foreseen, wasn't there in its existence, but in that moment, in that context, as we're going through exploration and exploitation, we may see emergence of something novel, and that's what we really want to see happen. And that's an assemblage. That's what's known as assemblage. The methods and tools are an assembly, and the emergence is an assemblage. So the easiest sort of example of this is a rhizome. So ginger is what's called a rhizome. It's no predefined plan or structure. Its patterns of growth emerge and adapt based on its context, its environment. A rhizome has no beginning or end. It's always in the middle. So that's the sort of theory behind assemblages theory. There's no predefined method, approach, or structure, no predefined framework. Unlike a tree, which is a reproduction, you plant one tree, you get another tree, they all sort of look the same, roots, trunks, branches, leaves, etc. A rhizome is not a reproduction. It's a short-term memory that operates by variation, expansion, conquest, capture, and offshoots. My notes are to the left, hence why I keep glancing across. But that's what we're trying to see. That's how I view essence. That's how I view the work we've done in the flow system. So I'm quoting my friend again, Dave Snowden, whose work is also being essentialized as Ivar referred to earlier on. Scaling is recombination, not replication. This is what a lot of the agile community are getting wrong. They're trying to apply case-based studies and one-size-fits-all universality in multiple different contexts, and they wonder why it doesn't work. This is what Dave Snowden means when he says complex systems scale by decomposition, to this phrase, the lowest level of coherent granularity, and recombination, not by imitation or replication. And that's what Essence is allowing you to do. It's allowing you to take multiple methods, tools, techniques, approaches, decompose them to their lowest level of coherent granularity. They've put a language around that, a structure around that, and then you can reassemble these from many different practices, pieces from the flow system, from disciplined agile, from story mapping to Scrum at Scale to other products and services and methods and techniques that have been essentialized, and bring them together in different unique and novel combinations within your contextual situation. And with a bit of luck, you get a little bit of emergence. Now, I'm seeing somebody saying it sounds similar to systems theory. The difference with systems thinking, it fits in that predominantly in the linear ordered sort of world, where complexity thinking deals with complex adaptive systems. And I'll talk about a little bit about the characteristics of assemblages, and then I will get into a little bit about complex adaptive systems. So an assemblage, the characteristic of an assemblage, it possesses tendencies of stasis, so order, stability, status quo, and change, non-linearity. This is one of the key things, one of the key aspects of a complex adaptive system. It's not predictable, it's not ordered, it's not linear, it is constantly evolving and changing. And as time evolves, so does the context evolve, and so the system is changing continuously. And therefore, the tools and techniques we apply in a complex adaptive system also need to evolve and to change. I spend too much time talking in meetings, losing voices. So assemblages are defined solely by their external relations of composition, mixture, and aggregation. So again, we're coming back to how we work in a complex adaptive system. And unlike SAFe and other large frameworks, there is no one-size-fits-all approach. There is no universality. So we bring things together, and those methods and tools and techniques that are decomposed and are brought back together vary by context and are against or counter to this concept of universality. And assemblages are viewed as becoming, as sort of coming together, constantly evolving and emerging based on context. And that's the whole point about being able to do exploration with the workbench and the cards and the different tools and techniques, go and apply in exploitation, come back and then reflect with explanation, so we can actually see the effectiveness of them and actually take those snapshots in time within Essence's workbench and say, okay, we went and applied, exploited this. Now we're doing some reflection. How do we come back and do further exploration to see how we can better exploit and better survive in the system that we're in that's constantly evolving and adapting? So the thing is, assemblages don't repeat exactly. And the challenge here is people want patterns, they want recipes. And the problem is there are no patterns or recipes. There are some things that you can repeat that are valuable and useful. Scrum is a repeatable pattern. It's a planning cadence. But depending on the context, now the context is evolving, you're not necessarily going to take a pattern exactly as it was used in context A and apply it repeatedly in multiple other contexts. So you have to start to look at things as the system is continuously evolving. And while patterns are useful, we want to utilize different components in different contexts with very intensity, order, and interdependencies, as the slide says. So this is some of the theory behind assemblages and using assemblies to try and find novel emergence. Now, the new book we've written, which is complementing the release of the work we're doing with Ivar on the Essence platform, is a major reference book. It's about 650 pages. It's broken down into a way that you can literally learn all these techniques. You can dip into the pieces that you don't know, learn the techniques, learn how to decompose them, learn how to recombine them, learn all the various different aspects from lean thinking, complexity thinking, distributed leadership, and team science. We put over 400 diagrams in the book. There's going to be over 40 downloadable free of charge worksheets. So when you read the book, you'll be able to take these worksheets and download them wherever you are in the world and use them with teams and groups to help them understand the different techniques. We also have been working with Dave Snowden, and Ivar's aware of this, on something called Hexi. We've been helping develop this. So this is a facilitator's approach to breaking down the various different tools, techniques, methods, and approaches within the flow system, specifically in this area. Other people are doing the same. So we're breaking things down into these lowest levels of coherent granularity in these various different areas. And then, of course, the magic is that, and the lean thinking ones, we're developing them at the moment. The magic is that we're spending a lot of time now, and with Ivar, Simon, and the team, we are now codifying the whole of the flow system. And there are multiple methods. There's over 40 methods and techniques in there, breaking down each of those methods, including work from Dave Snowden, like the Cynefin framework, things based upon commander's intent, we call leader's intent. Some examples here: complex adaptive systems, problem solving, various other techniques. We're breaking down into those lowest level of coherent granularity, those lowest level components, so that using the Essence cards and using the Essence workbench, we're able to look at different individual contexts and start to combine these with also methods and techniques from other providers into ways of building effective ways of solving challenges within different organizational contexts. That's all the slides I've got, Ivar. I'm going to stop sharing that because I didn't want this to be a big slideshow, but I wanted people to understand what my focus is in delivering this with Essence and what I see the power of Essence is, but to now to give people in the audience an opportunity to ask questions of us all, I think.
Terence, have you selected questions?
Yes, actually, the overwhelming majority of the questions were answered either by the audience or presenters. The only one that I saw in the chat that was not, and I don't know if this gentleman is still in the room, but Johan Tigler, I don't know if I'm pronouncing his last name correctly. Do you have examples with Essence for industrial DevOps with physical products like automotive, airplanes, and power plants?
I mean, we have a DevOps practice in our practice ecosystem, but
we haven't got too many specific examples, but you know, as Carlos was saying, actually, that the general principles and the approach of Essence is really, even though there's a software system alpha, the bulk of it is not really specific to software, and the next version of Essence that as a standard gets evolved will make that clearer and make it more clear that it's not just about software. So you can apply a lot of the thinking to products that are of any type, including industrial and automotive, and social, you know, business processes and business change and things like that.
I think one thing I'd add, Simon, is that what we're talking about here is different contexts, and automotive, aviation, robotics, DevOps, software development, whatever, are different contexts. What we're providing here is a very rich environment of many methods, tools, techniques, and approaches broken down into component parts with a standardized language around them so people understand which pieces do which, and a way to explore and exploit those different techniques and bring them together within your organizational context versus here's a template for DevOps, here's a template for automotive. We don't want to do that. It's the exact opposite of that we want to do, is not to provide a template, but to provide an environment that allows people to find what works in their unique context.
Thank you. There's another one in the chat and from Asdrubal Asensio. Do you have an example using Essence in presence of system of systems problem?
Yeah, I think the system of systems idea was very early described using how you can use cases and break down use cases to a system of collaborating systems. And there is nothing special about these practices as far as I remember. But there is, to my knowledge, not any practice, anything that has been essentialized. But it could easily be done, at least as I remember it. I wrote a book about basically systems of systems. We called it Software Reuse, and it was with Martin Gris. So at least according to that, we could have done it. Okay, anything more?
Actually, something just came in here. Steve Lewins.
You know, I'll answer to that if I can. I can see it in the chat and I'm reading that. So I was talking to my team about this earlier on. We're talking about Essence, talking about Hexing, these different things that were revolving these tools. I see Essence as being both a facilitator's tool, a practitioner's tool, but I actually see it being used in anger in large corporations as the digital platform, as the workbench for groups to explore challenges, or whether it's organizational design, whether it's sort of delivery challenges within an organization. So I see that really as a tool that will be used by a lot of experienced people who can facilitate those sessions. When I look at Hexi, which is the physical tools that we're using, which are very much like the Essence cards, I see those as tools that will be very much used by Scrum Masters, by Agile coaches, by practitioners. But then what if you're not in Agile? What if you're not in the Scrum world at all? You're in something else. So the equivalent of facilitators, whether it's design thinking people, whether it's sort of, organizational coaches, whether it's Lego serious play type facilitators, I'm one of those as well, where they'll use these tools and techniques to help facilitate exploration and exploitation sessions with people who would be relevant to participate. One of the things that really drew me to Essence is not just the cards, which I think are extremely powerful and useful, but it's the digital tooling. I think that's incredibly powerful. And in this distributed, digital, miserable hybrid world we all now live in, where we no longer meet people and enjoy conversation and coffee and good food and wine with each other anymore. We all live on Teams or Zoom. I think that digital platform is going to be a significant asset to organizations to bring people together to truly investigate scenarios and contexts and challenges, and then to use the decomposition of multiple methods and recombination in these complex adaptive systems to look at how we can actually better solve challenges. So that would be my opinion of how this will be exploited.
Yeah, I think that's a good description, and I think there is an evolution. So I think originally or traditionally, perhaps Essence was attractive to people in the methodologist space that were methodologists, or they were process engineers, or they spent their life defining practices and processes for others. And something that's very defined and language centric is attractive to groups like that. But as we've moved more into the digital world, and what we're trying to do with the Teamspace product is more democratize that. So using Essence less as a language you need to learn, and more as a set of tools that help you express your ideas, and building in a little bit of validation that helps you not make too many mistakes. So whilst you still need some skill and expertise, and getting your head around Essence requires a bit of a pivot, and you shouldn't need a lot of training to get some value, and then the more you use it, the more value that you can get. So for example, a Scrum Master using a product should be able to say, well, I'd like to create an extra work product, maybe to address one of the controls that Burkhard was talking about, without needing to be an expert in Essence. But if you do want to essentialize something bigger like the flow system, then having a methodologist's perspective is probably important.
I think games are useful for doing that, for sharing all the information we have about Essence, and all the games we are playing around the world about that are useful for that. I don't think it's you need something like a special role for essentializing the organizations, because it's completely different, the meaning in the Essence. Okay.
I'm interested to know what people think before we all break up for this session in the next few minutes. If anybody's got any comments they want to make, and whether they think we're smoking the funny stuff, whether we've got the right idea, whether decomposition and recombination is the thing to go, whether assemblies and assemblages are something that's resonating, whether people understand the concept of a complex adaptive system. I'm just interested on some of those thoughts, if any of the audience have got some feedback, because of course we're all off there as methodologists and practitioners doing this stuff. We could be doing completely something mad. I mean, the new book may be useless and not sell one copy, or it may be a runaway bestseller. I have no idea. We've just got these ideas that we think are useful, and I think Essence is a fantastic platform to actualize these ideas and to make them available to a hugely wide audience that might find benefit in using some of the madness that we might all have created. So I'm interested to know whether or not the audience out there think that we've actually created something that's good or not.
There is another question while we wait for some comments on the question that he posed. Any connection between Essence and AI at all?
Oh, that's a wonderful question. I have to answer that. I have to tell you my own interest in AI. 1981, I was still alive at that time. I wrote a paper at Ericsson, and actually I wrote a book, a little book, 50 pages, on how we could use AI to support software development. And I thought it would happen quicker, and it did. But in year 2000, I founded a company together with my eldest daughter, Agneta, and we created a product called Waypointer that actually supported rational unified process. So if RAP had survived, we had a fabulous product. It was used in several clients, and they loved it. So we had proven that at that time already that AI it could easily be adorn our software development. And we talked about things like a developer assistant, and that is a synonym of Copilot today. Microsoft has coined the Copilot. It's the same meaning. So it was in the control of the developer. The developer had a Copilot to help in creating models, to creating describing use cases, and so on. Now we have, but the problem was at that, of course, RAP died. The other problem that happened was we got the agile movement, and agile was anti anything related to artificial intelligence. So we had quite a lot of resistance. This was a company. The company was I acquired the company into my current company, and have been waiting for all these years to be able to come back. And that is exactly what's happening now. Essence is a wonderful, let's say, structure around which we can prompt questions. So without going into too much detail, but I can tell you we are now working very focused on being able to support the same practices we have now. Will be supported by ChatGPT-like technique, but also what we in the old days had, that is we called at that time expert system, but later we call them intelligent agents. So it's two different techniques. It's not only ChatGPT technique, it's also how you actually construct things. So AI will play an important role, and I predict, maybe I'm wrong, I've been wrong before, but I predict that the term agile will be less and less attractive because everyone is agile. And instead, we will talk much more about what AI can do to support us.
I just want to add, and there's a couple of comments I want to respond to, but just to add to what Ivar's saying, if AI, maybe we do need ER after AI, we'll see. But if AI is harnessed ethically and practically for the benefit of humans, not the other way around, then I think that AI capabilities in a tool like Essence could be very powerful, because they could start to help suggest combinations, help to suggest where we should flow and where we should look at different ideas. So I think AI has a role to play. It'll be interesting whether or not we just program all our biases in the machine learning and then it just comes up with the same nonsense that humans have been coming up with for millennia. But we'll wait and see on that. Just to Jeremy Doer's comment about systems thinking and narrow definitions, I'm going to take the Fifth Amendment. I live in Texas now, and let Dave Snowden reply to that one day, because I'm sure you and he would have an endless conversation about that. But I try to avoid the philosophies between the complexity in systems thinking and cybernetics and other worlds. But you make some very good points, some valid points there. And then one thing just to the team, really to the Essence team, is that I'm reading what Richard Gower's saying about, you know, the opportunity to embrace and experiment more. I'm wondering, and this is just an idea I'm shooting from the hip here, is could we figure out a way where people could participate in some short 2-hour workshops where they could learn a little bit more, not present, because what you did earlier, Simon, was really interesting and really sort of hooked people. But what if we could figure out a way where people could join for a couple of hours and just come into a small experimental workshop where we could see and actually try things out, whether they could physically try things out or whether they could participate in something where we're exploring certain contexts and how that might work. So there's more understanding of how the Essence language and the Essence utility, and I think that might help to educate people going forward, and those videos then could be shared so a wider community could understand how things are going. Just an idea.
If only there were a set of 40 practices we wanted to centralize and could do with some help accelerating it. Because actually the way that the flow system playbook describes the practices is each practice is a relatively concise short description, like Nigel showed some pictures of it, a lot of richness in the text, but it's not too much to read. And then what we've been doing is going through and pulling out the key elements of those practices, working out which part of the Essence language they map to, getting the descriptions from the book or from John or from Nigel, and then creating the sets of cards that you saw. So actually that's quite a nice workshopping topic that we could run with people, maybe do an hour a week for 2 or 3 weeks and introduce people to essentializing a practice for real that they can see in practice. And we've got some examples with how we did Scrum, we've got a workshop concept that we can use to teach people it, but there's definitely opportunities to do some more community stuff, I think.
Yeah, I think you're right. And I think if we could take something that's non-software or agile specific, something that would be usable in many different contexts, whether that's leaders' intent, whether that's Wardley mapping or something like that, and then use that as you say, through some workshops to show how we go from a explanation of a practice through to essentializing that to being able to exploit it within the system and the ecosystem. I think that might be very valuable. And so I'm willing to participate in that if we can set those up for people.
And of course, Simon, we have developed a practice to develop practices. It goes without saying. We need that, right? So we plan to give training in that. Anyway, it's one thing I really want to make a point of, and it is that we have avoided to essentialize ourselves, sitting in our chamber and essentialize. We see that happens. I mean, people are adopting Scrum, for instance, not people, a methodologist, he adopts Scrum, but rewrites it. And of course, there are misunderstandings, and the original author of Scrum doesn't like it. So we create animosity instead of having people helping one another and growing together. So we are not doing any practices like this, sitting in our chamber and come up with a better way of describing it using Essence. We do it together with the original author. And the original author is the decision maker. We are just a tool to help get that done. And I think that's a very important principle. It takes much longer time, of course. It takes, I mean, when we did Scrum, I can guarantee you it took maybe a couple of weeks for us to do it, but then it took months and months to get it discussed and approved by, in this case, Jeff Sutherland. And that makes sense. But after we are done, we have something sustainable.
Yeah, thank you everyone for joining. Obviously, we'll share the slide decks. We'll compile them and share them, as well as make the video available on demand. And please look out for future webinars and/or events, perhaps a workshop, as Nigel and Simon mentioned earlier. And thank you for attending. Thank you to all of the wonderful speakers for their time. And we'll see you soon.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank
Thank you
you.
very much.
Thank you.
I
Bye.